The supermarket doors slid open, and a rush of cool air greeted the steady stream of customers pushing carts through the entrance. It was mid-afternoon, right in that sweet spot between the lunch crowd and the evening rush. Shoppers weaved through aisles, some focused, others meandering, browsing labels, checking prices. Near the produce section, an older woman picked through a display of bell peppers, her fingers pressing lightly against the skin to test for firmness. A young mother juggled a restless toddler on her hip while scanning a shopping list scribbled on the back of an envelope. It was an ordinary day, almost too ordinary. And then there was Kevin. Dressed in his neatly pressed store uniform, a name tag pinned to his chest, Kevin moved with quiet focus, carefully arranging loaves of bread on a rolling cart near the bakery section. He took his job seriously, every loaf placed just right, edges lined up, labels facing forward. He hummed softly as he worked, lost in the simple rhythm of stocking shelves, a sense of pride in every small task. Kevin had worked at this store for nearly 2 years. At 28, he was one of the most reliable employees, always on time, always eager to help. The regulars knew him well. Some stopped to chat, others gave him a friendly nod in passing. A few minutes later, a woman approached the counter near Kevin's station. She wasn't a regular. She looked to be in her late 40s, with sharp, impatient movements and an air of someone who didn't like waiting. She sighed audibly as she set her basket down on the checkout belt, already drumming her fingers on the edge of the register before anyone had even acknowledged her. Kevin, standing just a few feet away, noticed her and smiled, stepping toward the counter with his usual enthusiasm. "Hi there, did you find everything okay?" His voice carried warmth, the kind that made people feel at ease. The woman barely glanced at him. "Yeah, just ring it up." Her tone was clipped, her eyes fixed on her phone as she scrolled through something disinterested. Kevin didn't seem to mind the lack of response. He was used to all kinds of customers, some chatty, some quiet, some in a hurry. He began scanning the items, carefully placing each one in a paper bag. Milk, eggs, a bag of apples. He paused for just a second, turning the carton of eggs slightly to check the top, making sure none were cracked. A small gesture, a simple habit. The woman suddenly snapped. "Oh my God, can you hurry it up? It's not that complicated." Her voice was loud enough to turn a few heads from the nearby aisles. Kevin blinked, startled by the sudden outburst, but he didn't stop. He just kept bagging, moving a little faster now, trying to do his best. But the woman wasn't finished. She crossed her arms, her face twisting in frustration. "Jesus, this is taking forever," she muttered under her breath, then louder. "Figures." The word hung in the air, cold and deliberate. A man at the next register paused mid-scan, glancing over. A teenage girl near the gum display lowered her phone. People noticed, but Kevin, he just kept going, because he was used to this. Still, something about the way she said it was different this time, and the worst part, she was just getting started. But she didn't know who was watching. Kevin kept his head down, hands steady as he continued bagging groceries. He'd heard remarks like that before, maybe not always as direct, but the meaning was the same. He didn't react, he just kept working. But the woman, her name was Angela, though no one in the store knew that yet, wasn't done. She huffed, shifting her weight from one foot to the other, clearly irritated. "Come on! I don't have all day," she snapped again, rolling her eyes as Kevin carefully tucked a loaf of bread into the bag. "Sorry," he said quietly, his voice even, controlled. He meant it too, because Kevin was the kind of person who apologized even when he didn't have to. But Angela didn't hear the sincerity, or maybe she didn't care. She exhaled sharply, throwing up her hands. "Oh, for God's sake, just move." She stepped forward, suddenly reaching toward the bag to do it herself, but in her frustration she knocked over the carton of eggs. Crack! A sticky mess spread across the conveyor belt. Kevin immediately reached for a paper towel, but before he could, Angela rounded on him. "This is exactly what I'm talking about. Her voice rose, sharp enough that a man browsing near the candy aisle paused mid-reach. "Why would they even let someone like you work here? This isn't a daycare." Kevin stopped, the paper towel in his hand still. The air changed. Nearby, a cashier named Jordan, a college student working the summer shift, froze mid-scan, eyes darting between Kevin and the woman. A few feet away, a mother gently pulled her child closer, watching but saying nothing. But Angela, she didn't see any of it. She didn't notice the shift. Instead, she leaned in, her voice dropping just enough to be cruel. "I don't have time for this," she muttered. "You shouldn't be working here if you can't even handle something this simple." Kevin swallowed hard, the words landing heavier than they should. He didn't cry, not here, not now, but his fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the counter. Still, he didn't speak. He just did what he always did. He kept going. He wiped up the mess, cleared the broken eggshells, and moved to scan the rest of her items, his hands just a little less steady than before. But the rest of the store, they were watching now. A woman in her 60s, standing 2 registers away, whispered something under her breath. Jordan shifted uncomfortably, clearly wanting to say something, but before he could, Angela let out another loud sigh. "Oh, forget it," she said, grabbing her purse. "I'll just go to another line. This is ridiculous." And just like that, she reached for her cart, ready to walk away. But someone else wasn't ready to let it go. From the far end of the counter, a voice cut through the tension like a knife. "That's enough." It was calm but firm, a voice that commanded attention. Angela stopped, slowly turned, and that's when she saw him. Mr. Daniels, the store owner. He'd been standing a few feet away the entire time, watching, listening, and now he was stepping forward. But Angela had no idea what was coming next. Angela's fingers tightened around the handle of her cart. Her face hardened, her stance shifting slightly, as if bracing for a confrontation. She didn't know who Mr. Daniels was yet, just that he was some middle-aged man in a button-down, standing with his arms crossed, looking directly at her. But she didn't like his tone. "Excuse me," she said, lifting her chin slightly. Mr. Daniels didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His presence alone shifted the energy in the store. "I said that's enough," he repeated, his eyes steady, unblinking. "I've been standing here for the last 5 minutes, and I've heard every word you've said." Angela snorted, shaking her head. "Oh, give me a break," she muttered, shoving her cart forward as if to leave. "I'm just trying to check out. He was taking forever, and I..." Mr. Daniels stepped directly into her path. She stopped. The store was quiet now. Jordan, the cashier, didn't move. The older woman from 2 registers down slowly set her basket on the floor. A man near the self-checkout leaned against his cart, arms crossed, watching. No one was pretending not to notice anymore. Mr. Daniels tilted his head slightly. "You know, I've been running this store for 23 years, he said, his voice level. "I've seen just about every kind of customer come through those doors. The impatient ones, the rude ones. But you..." He let the words settle before continuing. "I don't get people like you too often." Angela bristled. "Like me?" she echoed, her voice sharper now. Mr. Daniels gave a slow nod. "The kind who think they can say whatever they want to people they believe are beneath them." Angela laughed dryly, but it was forced. "Oh, please. You're being dramatic. All I did was..." "You insulted my employee," Mr. Daniels cut in, his voice still calm but laced with something colder. "You mocked him, spoke to him like he was less than you. And now that you're being called out, you want to act like it's not a big deal." Angela's lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't respond immediately, maybe because she knew she wasn't winning this argument. Kevin was still behind the register, staring down at his hands, shoulders stiff. He wasn't used to someone stepping in like this. Mr. Daniels turned slightly, glancing at Kevin before looking back at Angela. "You see that young man right there?" He gestured toward Kevin. "He's been working here for 2 years. He's one of the best employees I have. Shows up on time, never complains, does his job with more care than most people I've hired." Angela crossed her arms. "That's great," she said flatly. Mr. Daniels' jaw tensed, just for a second. "You don't get it, do you?" He exhaled through his nose, shaking his head slightly. "People like Kevin have to work twice as hard just to be treated with half the respect. And the moment he makes one small mistake, people like you, people who don't even know him, think it's okay to tear him down because it makes you feel bigger." Angela's nostrils flared slightly. The way the store was dead silent now didn't help. She could feel the weight of all the eyes on her. She shifted uncomfortably. "Look, I didn't mean—" "I don't care what you meant," Mr. Daniels interrupted, his voice low, steady, measured. "What matters is what you did, and in my store, we don't treat people like that." Angela's fingers twitched on the handle of her cart, her face flushed now, her irritation clear. But she was stuck, trapped between her own pride and the growing realization that she'd already lost this battle. She glanced around, her gaze darting over the sea of strangers, staring at her, waiting. She had two options, apologize or double down. But which one would she choose? Angela's lips pressed into a thin, tight line. Her gaze flickered from Mr. Daniels to Kevin, then to the customers around her, watching, waiting. The weight of their stares burned into her skin. She hated being put on the spot like this, hated losing control. "I don't see why is everyone acting like I committed some kind of crime," she muttered, voice lower now, but the defensiveness was still there. "I was just trying to check out." Mr. Daniels tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "Is that what you were doing?" he asked, his voice measured. "Because from where I was standing, it looked like you were tearing down a good man for absolutely no reason." Angela let out a breath through her nose, her grip tightening around the shopping cart handle. Kevin still hadn't spoken. He was standing stiffly, his fingers fidgeting slightly against the register, the familiar feeling of being the center of unwanted attention closing in on him. But this time it was different, because this time someone was standing up for him. Angela shifted uncomfortably. She looked over at Kevin, her expression unreadable for a moment, then scoffed. "All right," she said, shrugging one shoulder. "Fine, I'm sorry. Are we done now?" The apology was hollow, dripping with insincerity. Kevin glanced up for the first time, searching Mr. Daniels' face. "Is that enough?" Mr. Daniels exhaled quietly, but there was no relief in his posture. If anything, his expression hardened. "See, here's the thing," he said, crossing his arms. "I've been running this place a long time, long enough to know when someone actually means what they say and when they're just trying to get out of trouble." Angela's eyes narrowed. "Are you serious?" Mr. Daniels didn't move. Dead serious. Angela let out a sharp laugh, shaking her head. "This is insane," she muttered under her breath, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. "I don't need to stand here and be lectured like a child." "No, you don't," Mr. Daniels agreed, his voice calm. "But I also don't need to serve customers who think it's okay to treat my employees like garbage." Angela froze, her eyes widening just a fraction. "What?" Mr. Daniels stepped forward slightly, keeping his voice steady. "You're done shopping here," he told her simply. "Go ahead and leave." Angela stared for the first time, looking genuinely caught off guard. "You're kicking me out?" she asked, almost in disbelief. Mr. Daniels didn't flinch. "That's exactly what I'm doing." A ripple of quiet murmurs moved through the store. A woman near the self-checkout nodded slightly, approvingly. Jordan, the young cashier, finally exhaled, as if he'd been holding his breath this whole time. Angela, though, was furious, her face flushed red, her fingers gripping the cart so tightly her knuckles turned white. "You can't do that," she snapped. "You can't just throw out paying customers." Mr. Daniels raised an eyebrow. "You're right," he said. A beat, then smoothly he added, "But I can throw out bullies." The silence in the store was deafening. Angela gaped at him. For the first time in a long time, she didn't have a response. She looked around, searching for some kind of support, some validation that she was the one being wronged here. But all she saw were stony expressions, crossed arms, people waiting for her to leave. There was nowhere to go. She let out a bitter, breathy laugh. "Unbelievable," she muttered. "This is ridiculous." But there was no fight left in her voice. She grabbed her purse off the cart, whirled around on her heel, and stormed toward the exit. No one stopped her, but as she reached the door, Mr. Daniels called out one last thing. "I hope someday you figure out why this happened," he said, "for your sake." Angela paused just for a fraction of a second, but then she was gone. The doors slid shut behind her, and the store exhaled. For a moment, no one moved. The store was still, as if waiting for something. The tension that had thickened the air just moments ago didn't immediately disappear. It lingered, pressing down like an invisible weight. Then, slowly, the conversation started again. A man near the dairy aisle shook his head, muttering something under his breath before turning back to his cart. A woman at Register 3 gave Kevin a small, warm smile before swiping her card. The normal rhythm of the store began to return, but something felt different. Kevin hadn't moved. He was still behind the register, fingers lightly resting on the counter, his gaze lowered slightly. Mr. Daniels turned toward him. "Kevin," he said, voice softer now, gentler. Kevin looked up. His face didn't show much, but his eyes said everything. He was processing not just what happened, but the fact that someone actually stood up for him. Kevin had worked here for 2 years, and in those 2 years he'd dealt with a lot of small moments like this, the sideways looks, the muttered remarks, the impatient sighs when he took an extra few seconds to bag something carefully. But this was the first time someone had said something, and not just said something, done something. He cleared his throat. I can finish bagging," he said, voice quiet, almost hesitant. Mr. Daniels gave him a long look, then he nodded. "All right." Kevin got back to work. Jordan, the cashier next to him, watched for a second before glancing at Mr. Daniels. "That was—" he paused, searching for the right word. "That was cool," he finally said. Mr. Daniels chuckled quietly. "No," he corrected, "that was necessary." A few registers over, an older woman stepped forward. She placed a single carton of orange juice on the belt and looked directly at Kevin. "You did a good job today," she said simply. Kevin blinked. It was such a simple thing, such a small sentence, but it landed heavier than anything else. Kevin nodded. "Thank you," and this time he meant it. Across the store, people went about their shopping. The world didn't stop turning. But something shifted today, and Kevin wasn't the only one who felt it. But what about Angela? She was already out the door, already crossing the parking lot, but the words still echoed in her head. "I hope someday you figure out why this happened." She reached her car, yanked open the door, and slid into the driver's seat, but she didn't start the engine. Because for the first time in a long time, Angela wasn't sure if she was right. But was that enough to change her? Angela gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles turning pale. The parking lot was half full, shoppers coming and going, but she didn't move. She told herself she was just cooling off, that this whole thing was blown out of proportion, that Mr. Daniels was on some self-righteous power trip, and the people in that store were pathetic for ganging up on her. But deep down, a different thought crept in. Was I really that out of line? She exhaled sharply, staring out the windshield. The words replayed in her head. "You don't get it, do you? People like Kevin have to work twice as hard just to be treated with half the respect. You think it's okay to tear him down because it makes you feel bigger." She wanted to shake it off, to push past it, but something about it stuck, because maybe, just maybe, they weren't wrong. She didn't turn the key right away. Instead, she just sat there thinking. Kevin was still working. The shift was almost over, but he wasn't in a hurry. He bagged groceries carefully, the way he always did, took his time, making sure nothing got crushed. Some customers smiled at him, a few even said thank you. But what surprised him most was that a small line had started at his register. Not because it was the shortest, not because people were in a rush. They were choosing his line on purpose. Mr. Daniels watched from a distance, a quiet satisfaction settling in his chest. People noticed today. Kevin's co-workers saw it, the customers saw it, and Kevin, he felt it. For once, he wasn't just expected to brush it off, to let it roll off his back like it didn't matter. Today, someone stood up for him, and in the end, that mattered more than anything. Angela finally started the engine, but before she backed out, her eyes drifted to the store entrance. Through the glass doors, she saw Kevin at the register, still working, still being himself. And then, just for a split second, he laughed. It was small, just a moment, but something about it hit her in the chest. She didn't know why, but as she pulled out of the parking lot, something told her she wouldn't forget this. Not today, not ever. Respect is free. Standing up for what's right, that costs nothing. But doing nothing, that can cost someone everything. If this story made you think, even just for a second, then it was worth telling. And if you believe in treating people with kindness, with fairness, with the dignity they deserve, then share this video. Because sometimes, all it takes to change someone's perspective is witnessing a moment like this.